Good evening. Apologies for the late start. We just had a couple of technical issues which we're just resolving, so apologies for detaining you. Welcome to everybody for our event this evening, which is about human rights-based policing and the community perspective. Before we begin, I want to introduce myself. I'm Liam Herrick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and just say a little bit about our organisation before we get on to the business of this evening. Many of you will be familiar with our work over many years, and many of you, we're delighted to say, are members of our organisation. The Irish Council for Civil Liberties is the oldest independent human rights organisation working in Ireland. We were established in 1976, and today is actually a very appropriate date for us to be holding this event on, because as many of you will know, today would have been the 100th birthday of Nelson Mandela. And there is an exhibition in Kilmainham Jail at present celebrating the life of Mandela, which draws particular connections between the struggle for human rights and democracy in South Africa and the struggle for human rights and democracy in Ireland, and the linkages that's been there going back to the 19th century. But for the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, we have a particular connection because our founder, Kader Asmal, was also the founder of the Irish anti-apartheid movement and would go on to become a minister in the Free Democratic Government of South Africa in the 1990s. I say this by introduction to say that our work and our agenda, and if you look at our website, you'll see our annual report and the work that we're doing generally at the moment, is part of an international movement for human rights. And in every jurisdiction, the issue of policing tends to be at the very coalface of human rights, because it defines the relationship between the individual citizen, the individual rights holder, and the state. The relationship between the individual and state, both in the positive sense, in terms of the state protecting and vindicating people's rights, for example, the victims of crime, but also, of course, in the negative sense, where the potential of the power of the state to infringe on individual rights tends to find expression most commonly. Policing and Garda reform has been the highest priority for ICCL since we were established. We were established in direct response to concerns about human rights and policing issues in the 1970s, and that has been at the centre of our work all through that time. At present, we are involved in engaging with the Commission on the Future Policing, and indeed with the other Garda oversight bodies such as the Ombudsman Commission, the Garda Authority, the Policing Authority, and the Garda Inspectorate, in terms of the very intense processes of reform that are ongoing at present. And there's two particular pieces of work I just want to mention. One is a piece of work that we're doing, which is supported by the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, which is about defining what do we mean by human rights-based policing. And we will be publishing a report on that piece of work in September, and that research has been conducted for us by Alison Kilpatrick, who will be speaking this evening. And also, we are supported in our work in this area by the Community Foundation Ireland, which are funding events like this evening, the activities where we're taking the research that we've done to bring it to the public. Because we are an advocacy organisation, we don't do research for research's sake. We are trying to engage in a national conversation that's ongoing about policing. Our approach to this is to be constructive. We all know the problems that have affected An Garda Siochana and policing in Ireland in the past. We know the tribunals and the Commission's investigation and so on that have been concluded. But what we want to try to envisage is a brighter and more positive future for policing, where we capture the positive culture and tradition of An Garda Siochana, but try to find ways we can address the problems that have also emerged in our policing. And I suppose that's the background to this evening's event. What we're trying to do this evening is maybe to unpack a little bit this concept of human rights-based policing, because to many people it's jargon, it's conceptual, it's at an artificially high level. What we want to do is to bring that down to the ground. So the focus of this evening's event is about the community perspective on human rights-based policing. And we have three speakers in the first phase of this evening who are going to speak to how policing is experienced on the ground in Irish society. we know that not every individual, or not every community, or not every section of the community experiences policing in the same way. Some communities experiencing much more confrontational expressions of policing, and also much more intense levels of engagement with the police. And in other sections of the community, they require the services and support of the police to protect them from crimes that might be directed particularly at those sections of our population. So that's the purpose of this evening. We're going to hear from three experts, three individuals with particular experiences and perspectives on how the guards are perceived and understood on the ground. And then we're going to hear from Alison Kilpatrick, who has worked as the Human Rights Advisor to the Policing Board of Northern Ireland and has been involved centrally in how you actually translate the idea of human rights policing into policy and practice, and who bring forward some suggestions for what this might mean in the Irish-specific context. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker of this evening, who's Gareth Noble. Gareth is known to many of you here as a partner in Coady Lyons, one of Ireland's leading human rights law firms. And Gareth has extensive experience across a broad range of criminal justice and human rights areas of practice, but with a particular emphasis on the experience of young people in conflict with the law. Gareth Noble.
Thank you very much, Liam. I guess I just want to offer a number of observations, having practiced in the Children's Court since 2008 at this stage. I used to think that when I first went to the Children's Court 10 years ago, that I'd be able to relate very well to children because I was young myself. And I now realise that 10 years on, they don't look at me in the same way perhaps as might have been the case 10 years ago. I don't come with any statistics, I don't come with any studies, I just simply come with the experiences that I've had in representing children and assisting children, not just in the criminal justice system, but in the care system. And after the kind invite that I received from the ICCL, I decided that as part of my gathering of thoughts in relation to what I would say tonight, is that I would actually conduct my own rather informal focus group with some of the young people that I've met over the last 2 weeks. And so it was a rather informative exercise from my perspective, in that children that I acted for in the criminal justice system had a number of interesting observations to make. First of all, they totally get the idea of why we need a police force or a police service. And the whole concept of policing is therefore not an alien concept to many young people. But when we go on to how their experiences with An Garda Siochana that they have had, on the whole, it is pretty negative. And I think it's also really important that when I probed them further in relation to that, a number of them were able to identify individual members of the Gardaí who they had positive experiences with. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. And when I asked them to give examples, all of them were able to give me examples of positive interactions that they had. But they were, on the whole, whilst accepting that they had some positive experiences, their experience of the service as a whole is negative. And it's negative because they do see the overuse of stop and search provisions as unnecessarily restrictive upon them. They do find that when they are before the court on public order charges, that if the real truth were told, that their experience of what was being said to them, that if we use the same standards, that there will be a lot more people in the dock facing public order charges about the types of abusive and insulting behaviour that was directed towards them. And I have found over the years that acting for children from the age of 12 to 18, there is a raw honesty about children who come into conflict with the law in terms of how they then deal with the aftermath of prosecutions and so on. But there is a feeling, and there's certainly a perception, that many young people will not actually countenance pleading anything other than guilty, because they are of the view that it is not in their overall global interests to discuss the negative experiences that they have had with the police in the context of court proceedings. And the number of children who've said to me, I might say that on a Tuesday, but I have to go back into my community and I have to live and I have to interface with the same Gardaí potentially for the rest of my life. I then decided, well, perhaps I'm getting a rather skewed view, and I'll talk to children that I represent in the care system, and I will see, are their experiences the same or different to children in the criminal justice system? And there were remarkable similarities between children that I act for, not in the criminal justice system, but in the care system in relation to that as well. I then decided, as a third category, is that I do a lot of work with children with autism and their families. So I contacted a number of those families and spoke to the young people directly themselves. And again, their experiences of seeking out the assistance of the Gardaí or their interactions with Gardaí was on the whole a rather negative experience from their perspective. And they were able to distinguish. I spoke to a little 15-year-old boy on the phone who's on the autism spectrum. And he was very, very succinct in what he had to say, but he would distinguish, for example, about whether or not, if he had made a complaint to the Gardaí, would it be treated differently than if his mother or father had. And there is that overwhelming sense of not being heard and not being listened to. And it is such a pity, because let's not forget that An Garda Siochana was created as with a community policing style in mind. We know, for example, that from its inception as an unarmed police force, that the emphasis was on the goodwill of the people and their moral support. But from the perspective of young people, across those different categories, there is huge work to be done in terms of gaining that, in relation to gaining that confidence. Now, in very practical ways, how does that manifest itself in the children's court? Well, first of all, there are a huge number of charges that come before the courts, and again, this is totally anecdotal, I don't have statistics to back this up. But there are a number of charges that come before the children's court, for example, in relation to the aftermath of stop and search provisions being invoked. There are a huge proportion of those cases, for example, where children are subjected to drug searches, and of course a guard cannot stop a child or any person in respect of any search unless they have reasonable cause to suspect that they are in some way infringing the law. And there are in fact a huge number of prosecutions before the court in respect of obstructing drug searches, and I would venture to say that in fact there are way more prosecutions around obstructing drug searches than there are what the results of the drug searches are, i.e. there are a huge number of searches that take place where no drugs are found, so there are no prosecutions in relation to drugs found, but huge numbers in respect of obstructing drug searches. And I think we do need to have a conversation around the reasons why that is there. One of the big bugbears for young people is the idea that when they're out with their friends, they are seen as troublemakers. They see official attitude as being they're out to do no good. And a number of the young people that I spoke to over the last 2 weeks reflect that attitude. And I've lost count of the number of prosecutions, for example, that have been dismissed in the Children's Court on the basis of what we call Section 8 of the Public Order Act. And Section 8 of the Public Order Act involves Gardaí being permitted in certain circumstances to ask a person to leave the area for a particular reason. And failure to leave the area constitutes the criminal offence. But in order to actually ground a prosecution for Section 8, you also have to show that you are guilty of another offence under the Public Order Act, whether it's intoxication, whether it's indecency, whether it's abusive, insulting behaviour, whether it's obstruction or so on. So it's not a standalone charge. And the number of prosecutions that have been brought where it is simply a Section 8 public order charge, and you say to the guard in cross-examination, what other aspect of the Public Order Act was being infringed? And the number of Gardaí who don't know that in fact they don't have the power simply to say, move on here. It has astonished me over the years. So, in terms of how children's attitudes to the Gardaí, it would be unfair to say, and it would be unhelpful in the context of this debate, to say that there is a particular problem with An Garda Siochana as an organisation. Because children's experiences of other state agencies would reflect probably the same view, whether it's in terms of education or access to healthcare, or in terms of their dealings with the Child and Family Agency, TUSLA, and so on. All of those organisations, including An Garda Siochana, have much work to do in order to try and ensure that children, as young citizens, feel listened to and respected and so on. I have a lot of interactions then with Gardaí themselves, and I also have been part of a project where I go to Garda stations primarily in relation to young Gardaí to assist them training in terms of what we call the case management programme. And at all of those sessions, Gardaí themselves to me, Gardaí say themselves, we don't need more laws, we don't need more powers, we need more resources. And the Gardaí who sign themselves up or who are signed up for those programmes in terms of case management involving young people in the diversion projects and so on, they all talk about the lack of training that they have in respect of general interactions with young people specifically. We know that, for example, and I referenced it briefly earlier, we know, for example, that children with autism, a huge number of children come before the Children's Court now on public order charges, and when in fact, you know, the Gardaí may not be aware, for example, that they have a diagnosis as being on the autism spectrum, and that therefore their ability to address appropriately moments of pressure it can be somewhat compromised as a result of that diagnosis. And yet if there was more insight and more training about addressing young people with those specific additional needs, then I think we'd have a greater understanding as well in terms of, and I've discussed that on a number of occasions with Gardaí. So I think we need to also ensure that Gardaí don't look at children as mini adults. I think we need to ensure that Gardaí look at children as a particular section of society that requires support, that the brain is wired in such a way as a young person that they do not, unfortunately, on some occasions, make the most rational decisions about moving on or about submitting to research or so on. And I think we need to have a lot more of a conversation around that. Finally, and I know I'm totally out of time, I do want to just look then at the wider agencies. Section 8 of the Act in 2013 that set up the Child and Family Agency did lay great emphasis on the idea of enhanced cooperation about young people between the various state agencies. I don't see any evidence of that, whether I'm looking at the children in the criminal justice system or children in the care system, because we still have those organisations that are looking at each other. Gardaí are still, in effect, glorified social workers and are expected to be so after 5 o'clock and at weekends when that social work involvement is not there. And frankly, it's not fair on the Gardaí to expect them to carry out those added responsibilities without those powers. Garda diversion projects were slashed during the recession. I really do hope that in the context of recovery, that the Garda diversion project funding will be restored and enhanced. In terms of the policing authority and in terms of GSOC, for example, children who have complaints about Garda behaviour do find the GSOC website very difficult to navigate in terms of trying to, and it would be very helpful if we're having this wider conversation about how all agencies in the criminal justice system communicate better with children. It would be great to see a section on the GSOC website that would actually speak to children about how they might progress complaints. Because again, there is that feeling of not being heard, not being listened to, and that sometimes complaint system is something over there for adults, and that they'll be listened to, they'll be taken seriously, but we won't. What I would say, finally, to end on a positive note, is that we've had huge challenges in policing over the last number of years. Everybody in this room knows that. But with every crisis comes great opportunity, and as we seek to rebuild the policing services fit for purpose for the 21st century, let's put issues such as interactions with children and young people and people with additional needs at the heart of that debate. And let's then, when the dust settles and the fog clears, design a police service that actually goes back to its roots, a proper community-based police service that actually sees young people in particular as future adults and future good citizens, rather than people to be treated with caution and suspicion, often unfounded. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Karen. Our next speaker this evening is David Joyce. David is a solicitor and a travellers' rights activist with extensive experience working on behalf of the travelling community in different capacities over the years, and he's currently working with the Mercy Law Centre, which is a social justice organisation based in Dublin. Thank you, David.
I'm meant to be watching somebody in red that's going to give me a timer at some stage, and it's actually black now, so I better keep an eye on that person then. Yeah, thank you very much, Liam, for inviting us in, and the entire board of the ICCL for doing so. And I think the topic and the discussion obviously is an area of interest that I have, both personally and professionally, and I'm trying not to cross over in the next 10 minutes, but sometimes when I do speak in a professional capacity, the personnel or the personal capacity intrudes as well. So if there is an intrusion at any stage, I'll try and distinguish what I'm talking about. Having been asked to do this a couple of weeks ago, and then we said a brief as to what areas sort of covered, and I know there was a kind of general area of sort of obviously the relationship, the historical relationship between Gardaí and travellers, and looking at the area of racism and the treatment of travellers, and then there's lots of negatives I can put out there, and then there was an area of focus and to finish on the positives. I'm not sure that the hardest bit I have is to finish on the positives, but we'll try. I suppose just in speaking in the area of travellers, and there is obviously, again, I said I'm speaking in two capacities, both professionally and personally in some respects. And over the years, I suppose you look at the relationship between travellers and the Gardaí, and I think that some of the things that have been said already by Gareth in respect of young people, I think you'll find that within young people there are sort of sections or segments, and certainly you look at not all young people are certainly badly treated by the Gardaí, but you will find that certain young people from certain social demographic backgrounds, certain kind of cultural ethnic backgrounds, or certain racial backgrounds are treated badly by the Gardaí. And that's a reality. And what is that about? That certainly is about, a kind of a cultural capacity within the Gardaí as a body, not as individuals. Because coming from a minority community, I hate talking about generalisations. And among the Gardaí, there are individuals, and there are good individuals and there are bad individuals. But there's a culture within that, and I'm not going to describe it as a community, but within that organisation, within that institution, which has developed over the years, which almost makes it easier to see the kind of what they almost consider as a low-hanging fruit when it comes to sort of minor offences or minor crime. And so they can profile or certainly focus on certain categories, whether they're from ethnic backgrounds or whether they're from socioeconomic areas or particular socioeconomic backgrounds. You'll find that probably in the children's court, and I've had little enough experience, I wouldn't even go as near as to talk about what Gareth's been speaking about, but certainly you'll find the kind of people and the kids that appear before the children's court are certainly, would be substantially from the travel community or from certain lower economic income areas in Dublin City. And that's a reality. That's a reality we're dealing with. That's a reality, I think, of laziness on the part of the institutions and particularly the policing institutions, because they do it not just in Ireland but across the board. They find it across Europe, and certainly, I'm going to reference a report that was recently done in Britain. And I was just reading, and I just think this is the same thing as I could talk about here in Ireland. And it looks at the policing by consent of traveller Roma communities in Britain. But the issues and the recommendations are completely apt to Ireland. Why has it happened? And again, as I can't say, because growing up myself in the sort of 70s and 80s, my interaction with the Gardaí would have been fairly constant, and not because I was in any way committing crime or criminal or whatever, but because of who I was and the community I was part of. We travelled around a lot. We'd move into an area. There was a practice in Garda stations all over the country. Travellers come into an area, they have to be checked out. Usually checking out meant 2 or 3 squad cars turning up, taking details of all the males effectively in the area names, and normal checks. But if you pull in as a group of travellers, you were automatically checked. There was a campsite down the road for holidaymakers who were also receiving 40 or 50 new people in the one weekend. They weren't being raided, and the caravans weren't being knocked on and asked who's living here. But it was a common occurrence for travellers, and certainly something I experienced as a child, seeing this happening regularly. So there is a kind of a history of interaction that has effectively created and seen travellers perhaps as a criminal subgroup within Irish society. And obviously, if you're dealing with criminal subgroups, the body that deals with criminals in Ireland are the Garda Siochana, and they have to interact with those criminals. And that's how it's seen, and unfortunately I'm not sure if that's changing very broadly in the last number of years. I think there have been positives, and there have been a number of positive steps that have occurred, and certainly there are individual members of the Gardaí that are doing great jobs, as there is individual members of the travel community who are also trying to put forward solutions and ways forward. But as I said, looking at the history, travellers have existed in Ireland for centuries. You look at the foundation of the state, Ireland has only existed for just less than 100 years. But since its very foundation, travellers in Ireland have had a negative interaction with An Garda Siochana. Right through the 40s and 50s, annual accounts done by the state were carried out by An Garda Siochana. They produced the figures and the statistics on the traveller community. Nobody else in the country was counted by An Garda Siochana. No other minority community or any other community, were annually the statistics gathered on them and reported back to a central body, i.e. the Department of Justice. That happened for a period of 30 to 40 years, from the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. That was done. In the 1940s, an attempt to effectively register all travellers on a given day passed legislation in this state, which meant that all travellers on the 1st of May had to produce themselves in a Garda station that they were close to and register their children and register whether or not their children were attending school. These are the sort of measures that were introduced by the state to effectively, in a sense, control what was seen as a deviant community in a society. And that in itself has had its impact. That's had the reaction it's created. Because I'm not going to focus on the individual, because there are clearly individual travellers who have committed crimes and are investigated, and that is the role of the police that have to do that. But when you're dealing with a community that has been criminalised, or profiled as criminal or potentially criminal, then you're into a completely different scenario. And that unfortunately is continuing, and has continued for right up until the present time. I'm not going to go into the sort of more well-known sort of incidents, but they probably are worth mentioning. The incidents where we've discovered that travelling children as young as 3 weeks, 6 weeks old end up on the pulse system forever. We discovered that our rogue Gardaí who are quite prepared to use travellers as a stepping stone for promotion or a stepping stone to sort of solving crime. We've seen the reports out of tribunals. We've read the Burnfoot module where Gardaí planted guns on a traveller site because that was accepted. They would be happy to do that purely for promotion or for their own ulterior motives. They were individual rogue Gardaí, but they were part of a force that had a culture to allow that. As I said, recently I worked in a practice where we clients from across the board, but I remember having to review Garda evidence or Garda video evidence in a particular sort of incident, nothing to do with travellers, but more to do with a well-known sort of public order incident in a West Dublin suburb. But having to kind of go through hours and hours of Garda evidence, I was assigned it in the office, and I'd sit down and take notes. And once or twice I was struck by certain things, and I don't know if I was immune to what I was listening to or whatever, but we got video evidence coming from the helicopter, and as part of that evidence, the soundtrack effectively of the Garda dispatch unit is also with that evidence. Listening to it on 3 occasions in an hour and a half space, I heard the dispatcher asking for some Garda unit to approach a certain area or to go to a certain area because there were 3 suspicious. The first incident was 3 young traveller men acting suspiciously in a car. How they knew they were traveller men, or why they knew they were traveller men, or what travellers had to do with being suspicious in a car, I'm not sure. But that's the kind of thing that's happened. That's the kind of thing that effectively allows a kind of, as I said, a culture to a notion that travellers are effectively committing crime or effectively criminals. So there is a profiling effect going on, even if it's subconsciously happening. I was watching that particular video with a number of colleagues. Nobody seemed to notice it. I didn't notice it until I played it back and heard it a second time. I was like, oh, she did say travellers. What had to do with the actual activity, I'm not sure, but it was thrown in there as a particular. That was only 1 hour of a Garda dispatch tape I was listening to. They go on forever. I don't know if it happens around the country, but I know it happened in that particular area. So I could go on all evening about particular incidents, and I don't want to. So I'm going to move on to try and look at some of the positives. As I said, moving from the criminal side perhaps to the civil side, this is where most travellers have a lot of interaction with the Gardaí, because this is where I think the Gardaí powers of the Gardaí are completely and utterly abused. And they're abused in numbers of ways, and ways that are very obvious. That, you know, I'm always amazed that there are no individual members of the Gardaí themselves prepared to stand up and say, no, I'm not doing that. That's not my job. I'm applied for something completely different. I shouldn't be forced to do that. But unfortunately, in a hierarchical organisation, sometimes people don't have the nerve to do that. And I think, you know, that is, I think, a sad reflection of what's happening. And when I talk about here, I'm talking about where travellers who have, shall we say, been the subject of civil proceedings, you know, whether it's eviction proceedings or whether it's actions by local authorities to move them on or whatever. Suddenly, you know, the enforcement of a court order has to be held. Not just do you get the civil enforcement, not that you just get the people coming along and say, look, there's a court order from the court and you have to comply with it. But suddenly you might have the armed response unit, or you might have a large number of Gardaí, who are only there to keep the peace, by the way. They're not there to move travellers on or to enforce them. But it happens, and it's a regular occurrence. You know, right to the instance where you actually have members of An Garda serving civil summonses, or being used by civil summons servers, because of their previous history with the Gardaí, using uniformed Gardaí during the day to go and serve a summons in a civil case. I've dealt with 2 incidents recently in my own practice where I've had to pull up the solicitor on the other side and said that was completely unacceptable. It happens, and it's happening regularly. Unfortunately, I've been given a time, and I'm not allowed to continue and looking at the positives. I would recommend people having a little report that just came out in June. As I said, it's very much, I suppose, the kind of issues that arise in Ireland. And I would say from it, I mean, there are, you know, I've been kind of probably too negative here perhaps in some sense. But there are positives. I mean, the reality is that you are talking about 40 people. You know, travellers are Irish citizens. They deserve the same protections and the same treatment by their police force as every other Irish citizen does. And equally, travellers are also members of the police force, because there are an increasing number, and maybe that is something that is positive, that's going to change at some stage in the future. And the instance like where dispatch, you know, people who in dispatch stations can use the term traveller, or probably worse in some cases, very indiscriminately, might be challenged by individual members as to what it's got to do with, you know, having to deal with suspicious activity. Only when you have members of the community as part of the force. And that is happening, a small number, but I see it as a positive thing. Some people might say, well, why would travellers want to join the Garda if such a bad history of bad treatment? I actually see it as a positive thing. I think you can only change institutions in some way by being part of those institutions, and you bring a different culture into it, and you bring a different way of thinking to it. So I see it as a positive thing. I think training, and I think the very fact that we're looking at, you know, the role of Gardaí, the role of what human rights means, and what human rights policing means, is an important. It's a mirror that we can hold up to the force to say, you're not just about, you know, protecting us as citizens, but you're also about protecting us and treating us equally as citizens. And moving away from the notion that certain segments of society are criminal or inherently criminal based on their ethnicity, their socioeconomic background, or their colour. I'll leave it there, and I'll hopefully engage in some sort of conversation with people as we go along. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Our third panellist is Fiona Whelan. Fiona is artist in residence for Rialto Youth Project, and in 2010 she published the work Policing Dialogues, which is a piece of public art which engages with the experiences of young people interaction with the guards, but was very much aimed at trying to create new types of relationships and new types of interactions. And Fiona has a visual display which finally might just be able to work.
Sorry, I'm the awkward one with the PowerPoint slides. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the ICCL for the invitation. I'll just start briefly by introducing you to Rialto, for those of you who don't know it. A village in Dublin 8, not far from here, with a population of about 5,000 people. So Rialto is an area classified by the Irish state as disadvantaged. It has a strong history of community development projects, many groups established in the 1980s, the 1990s, as a response to the poverty, the drugs epidemic, unemployment, record unemployment amongst Rialto youth. Importantly, in the face of the state's classification of Rialto, the Rialto Youth Project rejects the term disadvantage as it implies no perpetrator, and instead has adopted the defiant language of oppression and marginalisation. And in its mission statement, it names that the organisation recognises as a starting point that we live in an age of inequality where working class communities are oppressed. So Rialto Youth Project operates on a principle of voluntary participation, and that really means that young people choose to attend the service. They're not assigned there, they're not referred there by the courts, they're not paid to be there like other training services. They choose to be there, they engage in projects because they want to. So since the mid-1980s, the organisation has built a strong capacity for arts-based work, what might be called socially engaged or community-based arts, where you would engage with a theme and inquire and open it up and bring in lots of voices. I've been arts in residence, as Liam said, since 2004. And together we've led projects exploring primarily issues related to class and gender. So the project I'll speak about today is a 4-year project that ran from 2007 to 2011, led by a collective of young people, youth workers and myself. And it started out with a commitment to talking about power. So central to the project was a collection of 60 anonymous stories gathered carefully over time, privately, with members of the collective and a wider group of young people in response to one simple question: tell me about a moment in your life where you felt powerful or powerless. Stories related to family, community, experiences of school and authority, all gathered, but the strongest theme to emerge when we analysed the stories was policing. This is important because we didn't actually set out to do a project about policing. We just talked to young people about power and powerlessness, and they brought up the theme of policing. And that set in motion 2 events, which I'll just briefly describe today. So the first was an event which we called the Day in Question in 2009 at the Irish Museum of Modern Art, and it involved 26 members of An Garda Siochana in the final stages of their police training, who were just being assigned to the Dublin South Central District. The event was developed in collaboration with Chief Superintendent at the time, John Toomey, and Training Sergeant Colin Russell, and was built around the reading aloud of a collection of young people's first-person anonymous accounts of policing by uniformed police officers, so that the police would read the stories of young people back to the young people, although anonymous. So these readings would take place in a triangular seating plan, a device that we had used in earlier works, which kind of highlights subject positions and the contingency of those that are seated together. The police officers occupied one side of the triangle, and on the second side we had a collective with young people, and on the third a group of invited witnesses. And this piece of work emerged because young people asked could they be heard by the police. And so in an age where people talk about voice a lot, we really wanted to flip and think about listening, and created a space where police might actually be able to listen to young people. So the Gardaí read aloud and then listened to a complex and nuanced collective narrative. There were stories about repeatedly being stopped and searched, and the effect this had on a young person's sense of freedom. This from one young man: I'd say I get stopped about 20 times a month just for walking around. I'd be walking, a guard would see me, stop me, ask me where I'm going. These are all different guards, and by now you'd think they'd know my name and where I was going, but they still have to stop me, have to see where I'm going. I wouldn't mind if I was doing something wrong, but I'm just walking. I'm going to the shop, they stop me. I'm going home, they stop me. I'm going to meet my mates, they stop me. There were also stories about negative treatment when attempting to avail of a public service in a Garda station. A young man describing the Garda response when he was refused the use of a pen, the Garda saying to him, I don't want to catch something off you. There were personal experiences of police raids on a family home due to a sibling's suspected criminal behaviour, when the whole family were subjected to degrading treatment and their property left in turmoil. There were many stories about being moved on, Section 8s being issued, constantly young people feeling they have nowhere to be in public space. Life became a process of being moved on. There was a story about a young man being arrested, taken and strip searched, a response that seemed completely disproportionate to the event that he described, that he had been arrested for. Naked, squatting, humiliated, the young man described it felt so disgusting. And every time I see that guard to this day, he smirks at me because he knows that he did that. So when asking Gardaí to read these stories and listen to them, we also included other relevant life experiences, such as a young person's desire to be a police officer, another young person's describing living with a brother with a drug addiction. This wasn't a black and white, good and bad set of stories, but a complex, real collective narrative. Young people, interestingly, didn't paint themselves as all good. They understood the difficulties of policing in an area which had a drug issue and of course has criminal behaviour. But they just asked simply, could they be treated with more dignity and respect? As Aegon Mulcahy of UCD, who I see is in the room, pointed out when later analysing these stories for us that the words used do not depict young people themselves as tough. In fact, they repeatedly talked about their embarrassment of being subject to police action. As one story relates, as Aegon said, it's so embarrassing emptying out your pockets, getting searched in your own area, and the storytellers continuously use your words like anger, fear, hatred and shame. So while there was stories of physical action and coercion, one thing Aegon notes is the stories, in particular the concept of recognition and that perceived lack of respect. One young woman explaining, "I feel so small, not even good enough for the dirt underneath their feet." And another young man saying, "We are not shite, they treat us like we're nothing." So in summary, I suppose these stories, for the most part, policing was experienced by young people as a humiliating ordeal. There was no recognition that young people had a right to exist in public space, to have personal liberty to walk in their own city. Young people's status was confirmed really by the fact that they felt they were being treated as suspects to be questioned and monitored rather than free citizens or humans, individuals to walk around. Some young people, I suppose, also felt that the police were being deliberately provocative. They want you to get in trouble, one said. They constantly knowing that you will get mad and they can then arrest you, which ties into some of the stuff Garrett spoke about. They know what they're doing. And then, of course, this contributes to a cycle of distrust in the police, which people will be familiar for. So I suppose in the event, we were trying to bring young people together with police, bravely young people telling their stories, but also Chief Superintendent Toomey, he really opened a door by giving us access to this group of Gardaí, and then the Gardaí participated by listening. And during the discussion that followed the readings, one young person actually said that this was a fantasy of his, to be in a space like this and have time to engage with youth. But he asked a very interesting question, which wasn't answered, it couldn't really be, but he asked of the guards, "Do you ever say sorry if you stop and search a young person and you find they've done nothing wrong?" So in a commitment to pursuing the inquiry, a year later, having reflected upon that with the police and young people involved, we moved towards another public event, Policing Dialogues, a 6-week exhibition and residency in the Lab Gallery in Dublin 1. And the gallery became an active space to talk about these issues, to publicly examine policing and young people. We did workshops, seminars, media engagement with young people. It was a weekly experience. But we also gathered more stories from young people across the South Inner City, because we knew this wasn't a Rialto issue, it's a city issue, it's a class issue. And so we engaged youth workers from across the city, who then in turn gathered stories from their young people and brought them to the gallery, and they continue to be placed in boxes in a kind of evidence room type scenario. Midway through the residency then, the same group of young people and the police came back and were facilitated by Peter Dorman and Cecilia, and we see Peter here as well from Community Action Network, to discuss, to respond to what the experience of the first tent had been like, but also to describe, I suppose, some of the complexities of neighbourhood relations of power. The Gardaí themselves shared accounts of policing. They described a lack of resources, a lack of familiarity, a lack of training, and lack of understanding or reading of young people's behaviour. So new understandings were reached on a personal level and new insights were gathered. These insights then, plus the stories and the other events, were all then fed into a weekly training inquiry, which we held after hours in the gallery, where a representative group of young people and youth workers from our Rialto Youth Project, and Gardaí, Sergeant, and the new Chief Superintendent then, Michael O'Sullivan, and we tried to figure out how best we could incorporate an awareness of power, dignity and respect into relations between young people and guards. So the process explored the current structure, well the structure at the time. It explored the training of guards, the relationship between young people and police, and really tried to figure out how we could mutually enhance community policing based on all of what we'd unearthed through the process. And then we had a press release on the 5th of December 2011, which we announced that 2 modules had been co-developed by this group, which were, a group coming from all sides, and we had co-developed two new modules which everybody felt could be a useful induction programme for new Gardaí assigned to Dublin South Central. One was understanding young people's behaviour, which ties into what Garrett was saying, and the other was understanding areas of urban disadvantage and poverty. But as people will know, the Garda Training College soon closed for 4 years, and there were no new Gardaí assigned to the district. So obviously the process stopped. There was no CPD funding either, and we ran out of ways of making what we had developed happen. So in 2015, when the Garda College reopened with a new BA in Applied Policing, myself and Jim Lawler, who I should have said, the manager of Rialto Youth Project, who's here also, have been central to this process. Myself and Jim reinitiated contact with now another Chief Superintendent, Frank Clerk, and now our third, to discuss the implementation of the training that had been agreed and announced, by all parties, and to figure out how we could do it. And we engaged in a series of meetings, one of which included us going to Templemore to try to figure out where it might be better placed there or back up in Dublin. Things were looking kind of interesting, and I won't labour the story, but just to say that the energy seemed to go a little down in 2016. An internal Garda discussion was taking place between Templemore and Dublin South Central, and they pretty much stopped communicating with us in relation to where this was going. So the training wasn't implemented, but I suppose we appreciate in that time that An Garda Siochana have had bigger issues, so we are aware of that, obviously. But I suppose we just really believe that at the core of this really highly collaborative project, fairly innovative, careful, really inclusive, and it did provide real issues, real ideas for training that could be mutually, beneficial and could make some headway in kind of humanising of the other between young people and guards, and break some kind of cycle. We know that we have something to offer. We've been contacted in the year since by individual guards, which is kind of interesting, who've heard about the project and rang us and want to understand what we did. By journalists, by cross-border research projects, by the Children's Rights Alliance in their engagement with the policing authority. People are interested and we're happy to talk about it, but I suppose we're at the stage of we'd love it someone to take it and for it to have some kind of other value. And we really believe that youth work, I suppose, is the space that this should manifest in, because youth workers have the relationships with young people on the ground and can really work at those really careful negotiations that are needed to bring parties together. So I suppose just in that context, we really welcome the proposal by the ICCL, human rights-based approach to policing.
I think it's a fascinating piece of work. So you've heard three different perspectives from the community, but the response that we're going to invite now is from Alison Kilpatrick. Alison, as I said earlier, is currently completing a piece of research for the ICCL about how we translate the principle of human rights-based policing into the policies and practices of An Garda Siochana in the context of the ongoing reform processes. Alison is a barrister who practices in the broad area of human rights in Northern Ireland. She is a graduate of Queen's, the Inns of Court and the College of Europe in Bruges. She has published extensively academically. She was a commissioner on the Independent Commission on the Future of Housing in Northern Ireland, so she's very much grounded in the social context as well as the criminal justice context, and was previously the chairperson of the Simon community in Northern Ireland. Between 2009 and 2017, she was the independent human rights advisor to the Northern Ireland Policing Board. And in 2016, she was appointed as a senior legal advisor to the UK's independent reviewer of terrorist legislation. In Alison's work that she's currently conducting with us, and indeed in our work more broadly in the relation of Garda reform, we do refer extensively to the experience in Northern Ireland, because we do believe that there are many lessons to be learnt from the extensive investment in policing, and particularly human rights-based policing reform in that jurisdiction. And we do believe that there's a lot we can learn. Of course, there are distinctions. So I'd like to hand you over to Alison Kilpatrick.
You make me sound like I almost know what I'm talking about. Thank you. As I was listening to three panelists, three things were going through my head simultaneously. The first was that I recognise everything that's being said from my work in the North. Nothing came as a shock to me. And I don't know if that's a comfort to you or not. I sort of offer it as I hope it might be. You're not a breed apart here. It has been experienced in the North, and I think we found a solution to some of it. The other thing I was thinking was, I wish there were far more guards here listening to this. I'm not asking you to identify yourselves if there are any here, but I'm sure there are. Oh, there is. Congratulations, you're very welcome. Can I ask, do you mind if I ask if you're from the sort of community side?
Yeah, I'm from the Garda Community Relations Centre, the Garda Diversity Unit.
You're extremely welcome. It's really good to see you here. I've spoken to some of your colleagues and I regard them very highly. And this is no disrespect, But the guards I would really like to see here are guards not from the community side. However, those first response, what we might call riot police, security police, the armed response people, because I don't think they listen to this sort of stuff. Community guards, they go to these events and they come to things like this and they work with young people. And I think you do it pretty well. And as Gareth said, it's a good tradition here of community policing. And I have nothing bad to say about that. But some of your colleagues, I think, really could benefit from hearing some of these stories and really thinking themselves about how they apply them. And the third thing I was thinking was, how on earth do I follow that? And my heart started to sink as I realised I can't. I really can't, because this is the lived experience. This is the really important stuff. Sorry, I keep looking at you. I'm going to turn away from you now. You're up to you've done your bit. This is the really important stuff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what a human rights approach is, and it's probably going to seem very dry and very boring after all that, but I'll try and make it relevant towards the end. And what I'm going to do is, I think it's something I was always taught not to do, and that's answer the question first and then work backwards. I don't know if there's a question up there, but the question I posed to myself really was, is a human rights-based approach the answer to any of this? And I'm going to suggest that human rights-based approach is not an answer to this. What I'm going to suggest is the only answer. It's not one of a number of options. This is the way to go, and it is evidence-based. And when I talk about policing throughout the next 20 minutes or so, I do that very deliberately. I'm not talking just about police. And that's because a human rights approach has got to apply across the broader policing family. It's not confined to An Garda Siochana. The oversight and accountability bodies must embrace the integration of human rights standards with as much enthusiasm as they will expect of the Garda Siochana. That single thread of human rights needs to run throughout police, what the police do, but also what oversight bodies do. So everything that the police do, but every element of oversight must also have its own human rights standards. And I don't just mean that the oversight bodies look to what the police are doing, that they're complying with human rights, but they also establish their own frameworks and policies and approach their work from a human rights perspective. And what that requires, and I saw this really my first week of working with the policing board, it really does require that paradigm shift where everyone involved takes the usual accepted way of doing things and just throws it up in the air and starts again and starts thinking about things and looking at things differently. And everyone has to invest in this equally. And if there is a single lesson we learned from Northern Ireland, it's that everybody involved in this needs to be agreed that it is the way forward and how they're going to bring it forward. So having said that human rights approach is the answer, I suppose I should say what I mean by a human rights-based approach. And it is a bit jargony, it's a bit sort of woolly. It's actually very practical, or it should be if done properly. In essence, it's an approach which places the rights contained within the European Convention on Human Rights at the centre of everything that the police do. Every decision made, every action taken. And I mean every decision, every action of the service as a whole, but also of individual police officers and civilian staff. And I should probably just note that when we talk about a human rights-based approach, a really comprehensive one, it doesn't just start and stop with the European Convention and human rights. Other international treaties are relevant. And the reason I mention this, I think, particularly interesting, is the optional protocol to the UN Convention against torture, which I know a lot of people are very interested in seeing ratified here. That remains relevant, even if Ireland hasn't ratified it. It's signatory to it. And the European Court of Human Rights certainly will take account of it when interpreting other convention rights. So don't start with and stop with the convention. Look at other treaties and see how you can give effect to those. So a human rights approach should mean, if it's done properly, that human rights run seamlessly through policy, through training, through operational application, powers and duties. And they should inform organisational strategy of the police service, its internal governance and relationships, the delivery of its policing services. I'm reading a list now because I was trying to write down everything that should be covered. The planning of operations, I mean all policing operations, and police engagement with oversight bodies and the community. And within a framework, this paradigm shift has been accepted and we start thinking differently. Police should really welcome oversight and accountability and embrace transparency. They should recognise that it makes them stronger. After all, those are the very principles that value and protect peace, democracy and the rule of law, and that is what a police service is for. That's their job, and how else do they do it if they aren't subject to oversight, accountability and transparency? So the purpose of the human rights approach, well, it's to secure a policing service and oversight framework that are professional, efficient, effective, ultimately respected and trusted by the public they're there to serve. And that's what I know you're all trying to get to. A police service, An Garda Siochana, that is trusted across the community and has earned that trust. And by the way, I don't suggest that they aren't trusted across the community, but there is some work to be done, and I think they recognise themselves. There is some repair work to do in terms of their legitimacy and community confidence. You want the public to accept the policing service, not just the concept of the police service, but the policing service, and recognise police officers as defenders of human rights, because that's what they are, they're frontline defenders. But too often I think we see, and sometimes the justification, if you certainly listen to some of these stories, they can be potential violators of rights, and that's where the tension I think really arises. Police officers, when they accept a human rights approach and change their thinking, they start seeing that the protection of human rights is the foundation of what they do. It's the core purpose. It's not an obstacle to their work. And you do hear people saying, oh God, we're going to have to human rights stuff, hands tied behind our backs, or we're going to have to be making silly decisions, and we're not going to be able to do what we need to keep people safe. It's just not true. And Northern Ireland is an example of that. If anything, it empowers officers, it gives them greater scope, it enables their decisions, and it protects them. Because if those decisions are made within a proper human rights legal framework, they're going to be safe if they're challenged in a courtroom. And they're going to be more effective, and the public are going to accept them, they're going to have confidence in them, and there's not going to be the same sort of tension in the street. So if you want to make your job easier, then start by making it a little bit more difficult and adopting this human rights approach, a real meaningful approach. I'm already diverting myself from what I was going to say, so let me just come back to I can never trust myself, I always have to write something down. I think one of the other things that struck me when I was doing some of this work is that people look at, or rather, the community looks at abuse, human rights abuses as things done to the community, often by the police or the state in some emanation. The police see human rights abuses as people being victims of crime, and they're there to stop people becoming victims of crime. But human rights is about so much more than that. And if you look at the European Convention as interpreted by with other treaties, you see that it protects us from much less visible human rights abuse. And I talk about invasions of privacy, restrictions on freedoms to assemble to protest, due process if accused of wrongdoing. Police are constrained in what they can do by the power they're given. They don't. They have discretion in reaching decisions, but they can't extend outside of the law that is given to them by the democratically elected representatives. But within this element of discretion, how do you reach a decision? The law, Irish law, doesn't give you the answer, and I suspect, sorry, I'll come back to you, I suspect sometimes you say, okay, I know what the law says I cannot do, I know what the law says I can do, but what should I really do? I have a few options here. For example, in public order, stop and search. Where can you turn? Well, you can turn to the human rights principles and standards, and that will guide your decision making. And that's what you have not got at the minute, as far as I can see. And that's despite the fact that Ireland already requires the Garda Siochana to comply with the Convention. Your European Convention on Human Rights Act 2003 already makes it a legal obligation to comply. It's express, but it is often, when discussed, watered down in terms of it's an aspiration, principle, objective, and if you look at some of your legislation, you'll see it actually framed in those terms. Garda Siochana often say, and I had a look on their website just on the train on the way down here, about vindicating human rights, about their aspiration to vindicate human rights, about their desire to protect human rights and practice, etc. But let's be very clear about this. If they do not do that in practice, then they're acting unlawfully. There's no ifs or buts about it. It's not hope, it's a legal obligation. And I think sometimes when we talk about this, when we talk about human rights and human rights approach, we almost denigrate it to something which is sort of aspirational, discretionary, something we can take or leave at times, get hard, and we need to move away from that. So human rights and the protection and fulfilment of human rights should be a core function of policing. It's not a value of policing. Values are great, but it's a core function and a legal responsibility. I think is what we need to keep coming back to. So in Northern Ireland, we adopted this approach following the Patent Commission, and I know most people here have heard of the Patent Commission and the reforms that followed. But what that seminal report did was begin a process, a root and branch review, and it put human rights at the centre of everything the PSNI was to do. And it resulted in cultural change, cultural transformation, which did end up translating into practice on the ground, but it took a lot of work. But it has been hugely positive for police and public. And that's the assessment, not just of me and others, but of the chief constables, successive chief constables. And they're the ones on the street, feeling maybe sometimes they've had their hands tied behind their back, but their operational assessment is that it works, not that it gets in the way, that it's actually an empowering thing. Now, I do have to say, I think this is a good example of why constant vigilance is important. The legacy of the past in Northern Ireland and the state's treatment of allegations, state involvement in deaths, have put enormous strain on police public relations recently. And the alleged failure to comply or to apply convention principles to investigations into the past has, I think some would say, fairly cast doubt on the whole reform process. And the reason I mention that is, firstly, to be honest about it. It's not all been successful. But also to highlight, I think, that a departure from a human rights approach in one area can very quickly and fundamentally undermine confidence in the police in lots of other areas, even where good work is being done. PSNI have done some very good work in other areas, but I think this remains one which potentially undermines the whole notion of reform. So it has to apply across the board. There can't be any area which isn't human rights compliant, where you'll infect every area. A lot has been said in the past. I've read a lot about culture ethos within An Garda Siochana, and certainly when I was doing some of my work, people kept saying to me, it's very different down here, so it's not the same as up north. We can see why you need it up north. I'm not sure we need this approach down south. I have to say, when I read some of the tribunal reports and other people that I spoke to giving their views, it doesn't sound very different at all. It sounds very, very similar. You're facing the same challenges, same cultural difficulties. I'm not going to. I had some quotes from Patton about how they found the RUC when they first began their investigations, but I won't trouble you with those. It sounds very similar, put it that way. Intransigent. The whole policing family, as I've said, is critical to this. The whole policing family needs to agree how you're going to do this. So you can't just sort of do it piecemeal. You can't develop this as it goes along. You need to agree, you need to promote, you need to encourage officers and public and government and everybody else who's going to be involved in this. This is the right way forward. And then establish the mechanism for doing it and be relentless in pursuing that mechanism. I think one of the greatest weaknesses in Northern Ireland, and I tell you this again in a spirit of openness, the Northern Ireland model, so you don't think we've sorted it, everything's brilliant and look what I did. There are weaknesses, and one of the weaknesses that was exposed was in relation to a sort of dissonance, I suppose, or disagreement about human rights themselves, about whether or not human rights were, as applied to all members of society and as the method by which one measures police, whether that was a value which even oversight bodies agreed on. There was a disagreement about that. Someone questioned their commitment to human rights as a core value of society. And that's a problem, and that's coming from within your oversight bodies, which have a statutory duty to monitor human rights compliance. You need to be, I think, conscious of that. You need to put the right people in there. In Northern Ireland, it undermined the process. Let's be very clear about that. And it did a huge disservice to the police. The police were working away under a Chief Constable, George Hamilton, who was absolutely committed to the human rights approach and striving to keep it going and protect the work he had done. Meanwhile, some of his oversight bodies were less than supportive of human rights, let alone a human rights approach to policing. So this is something that needs to be nourished, it needs to be protected, and everybody needs to sign up. Everyone needs to buy into the programme. So once you've agreed that you're going to do it, I suppose the big question then is, what is the plan? And this is where I look to some people in this audience and suggest that you have those people probably in this room. Human rights experts, legal and other experts really can help, but also the community experts, and they're the ones with the expert on the lived experience of policing. They can help Garda Siochana, but also the oversight bodies, it seems to me, develop their new frameworks, and there's going to have to be a framework within which you work. They can advise on policy, training, practice on the ground. But what you do need to, and I take myself out of this categorisation, but you do need to get people of sufficient standing and experience, because what they're going to have to do is really exert authority and challenge police. And it's what I can tell you from experience is that is not straightforward. It is not simple. Police culture can be exclusionary. Police can be reluctant to accept that non-police understand them, have anything to add, are ever going to improve anything. I think it's Brennan Bain quote, there's nothing that couldn't be made worse by the arrival of a police officer. The police officer turned that back on me and said there is nothing that can't be made worse by the arrival of a human rights lawyer. And it just, that's how we started, and that's how we went on. So you will get resistance, there will be hostility, and some people will never change, they'll never accept that this is a good way of doing things. So you really need somebody who can go in there and stand up to it, and you need to support them and protect them. In PSNI, they have their own internal human rights advisors, which has been very important. So they employ full-time a legal advisor who gives policy and operational advice. So he will sit in command rooms often, and sometimes during security operations, and give advice, real-time advice, and that's been invaluable. It also employs a full-time human rights training advisor, which has been invaluable. So they train the police trainers on human rights. They review all the training to make sure that human rights are run through all of it, and they operationalise it and put it into the context. And he has both legal and teaching experience. I was, until September 2007, an independent advisor to the policing board, and I was slightly different in that I wasn't an employee and I wasn't full-time, so I was a sort of external independent consultant. And I do think, if I may be so bold, that the independence in a role like that is absolutely critical. It can't be done by an employee. It can't be done by somebody who's beholden to the organisation you're advising. Definitely see a role for it within policing, but when it comes to the oversight bodies, I think that independence must be maintained. And that was, in my experience, probably the hardest bit of the hardest aspect of the work, because you're very much on your own, but that's what you're valued for. So you have your people in place, you have your monitoring framework agreed, and that's the stage at which you really need to get stuck in. And police policy, I think, probably is going to be one of your first ports of call. That needs some really very close attention. Not just because there isn't an awful lot of it. I didn't find as much written policy as I thought I might. Now, maybe it's hidden away somewhere. But a member of the public, just coming to An Garda Siochana site, you're not going to find very much written down to tell you what police policy is, and that in itself is a problem. So the policies that are published, I don't think really have been sufficiently human rights approved. So somebody's going to have to look at those and really human rights approve them properly. And then share them with the public. Share all of it. Every single bit of policy you can should be put into the public domain. It demonstrates transparency, which is a fundamental aspect of legitimacy. But I think more importantly, it tells the public what to expect of the police, and the police what to expect, or what the public should expect of the police, and what the police expect of them. If something is going to be, if law and action is going to be human rights compliant, people need to know what it is, what's clear and accessible. The European Court keeps telling us this. If you can't even find it, if you don't know what the police are going to do in a given situation, for example, public order situation or stop and search, how do you know what is expected of you so you don't fall foul of the criminal law? PSNI has published all of its policies and service instructions are very, those are quite detailed documents that contain information on how the police will actually conduct an operation. And it is only saved those that contain such sensitive information that it simply can't be put safely into the public domain. Those documents are shared with me, so I've seen all of the sensitive documents, and I was able to go back to the policing board and say, you know, there may be an issue here which I will pursue on your behalf, or everything's fine. So at least somebody had access to it. And the police had to justify to the policing board why certain documents weren't published. And of course what the sort of triangulation enabled was I was able to look at it and say, I think in fairness to them, I think this is information which really shouldn't be published. I think they've made out a reason to withhold it. And that worked pretty well. Here, nobody is going to see it. As far as I understand it, nobody has access to that stuff other than those people operating the policies. And that, I think, is possibly one of your biggest problems. So PSNI adopts what they call a no surprises approach, and it hasn't left them open to criticism. It hasn't left them subject to counter tactics being operated on the street. It has been very successful. People know what they need to do to avoid conflict with the police, and the police know that the public are going to support them in that. The more I look at what I was going to say to you, the drier and drier it becomes when I think about what was said. So what I think I'm going to do is move on to the examples, the stories that we heard tonight. But just ending with one really important aspect, I think, that I'm sure anybody who's tried to do any work on this in Ireland will tell you, is there is no disaggregated data available. So you try and find out whether young people are stopped and searched disproportionately. You're not going to find the answer unless you've got somebody friendly within An Garda Siochana who's prepared to tell you, and I'm not sure they can tell you. And I think that in itself is a really serious issue, because you don't know where to start. You don't know what your real issues are, because this data isn't made available. So somebody needs to sort that out. And PSNI, again, a very good example of how comprehensive the collection, then analysis, then publication of disaggregated data can be. So looking at what we've heard tonight, I think Northern Ireland is a very good example of how this can be, how some response can be put together in relation to this. What I did on behalf of the board was conduct thematic reviews from a human rights perspective on policing with children and young people. So I pulled some chance. I've already skipped loads. Count yourselves lucky. No, I will be very quick. I conducted a number of what we call thematic reviews. So people would raise issues of particular concern, and children, policing with children and young people was one of them. Came up all the time. Everybody I met said there's a problem with children and young people and their relationship with police. Police would say there's a problem with children and young people, but maybe unsurprisingly, they saw it as a problem. So antisocial behaviour. Youth is causing annoyance, literally was how it was recorded in police statistics. Youth is causing annoyance. So there was a real issue here. So what I suggested to the policing board was, right, let's look at policing with children and young people, not just as a community activity, but let's look at it from the perspective of stop and search. Let's look at it from the perspective of moving young people on, seizing alcohol, drug searches, corralling, all the stories you hear. Child protection issues, engagement with young people, and examine it. Let me go and look at all the documents that they say they can't publish. Let me examine it, let me do a report, let me make recommendations, and we did that. But it started with me meeting with young people themselves, those advocating for young people. And we called it, I remember at the time, children from difficult social realities, which was a very polite way of saying children who'd had a really difficult, continuing difficult life and relationship with police and the state, and everybody who said they were there to help them and just seemed to make their lives worse. And I spoke to them and they said the same. Every single one of them had a similar story. It was remarkable how consistent the experience was. So I looked at the way they trained, for example, police officers to deal with children and young people. And the recommendations then that were issued, all were accepted, I think apart from one. All were implemented in theory when I went back to it 12 months later, maybe less so. And that's maybe something worth thinking about as well, is make a recommendation, it's accepted, they tell you it's implementable, don't accept that, you have to go back and check that it has actually been implemented. But what struck me from this thematic review of policing with children and young people was that children were spoken about by the police an awful lot and by other state actors. They were very rarely spoken to, at least not in any meaningful way. And what I did with this thematic review was speak to them and ask them what the issues were. And I suggested the police speak to them in future, and they did. And honestly, I came out of one room with the police officers and their faces, I don't think their jaws closed for about a day afterwards. And these were police officers who told me they'd seen it all, they'd been around 20 odd years, they'd dealt with these wee rips, as they called them, for many years. They came out of the room and they looked at themselves and each other and they said, we don't know anything about these children's lives and we're not making them any easier. So it was a huge change. They also realised that what they've been doing was subjecting them to unfair stereotyping, and Gareth talks about this, and I was seeing it all the time from policing. And that infected the approach, because children became the problem that had to be dealt with. And what the human rights approach did was flip this on its head, so the police started to accept that children were rights holders, and they had to be respected, and they had to be protected. And when they started looking at it from a from the basis of them as rights holders, everything changed. They stopped corralling them, they stopped moving them on, they stopped assuming they were up to no good. They started looking at why they may be on the streets. Are they victims of domestic violence at home, for example? Do they have a home? All these questions started to arise. How can we help these young people? What do we need to do to protect them? We're there to protect them, not simply to corral them, move them on, or put them through the criminal justice process. So speeding up, very practically what they did, they human rights proofed all of their policies. So stop and search, use of force, public order policing, all from a human rights perspective, but also a children and young people perspective. They expressly incorporated, so they wrote into their policies the relevant ICCL rights, and also the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was appended to their overarching policy on policing with children and young people. Dramatic change of thinking, and it was hugely successful. They translated it all into operational contexts. They delivered training operationally. What does it really mean if you're dealing with a child in a stop and search situation or a public order situation, or you're thinking of using force? What does it really mean if it's a child rather than an adult? They translated those policies into child-friendly formats, and they distributed them widely through youth groups, and many of those advocating for and with young people. And they actively encouraged children and young people to give feedback. So they set up independent advisory groups in which children and young people sat, and they really listened to them, and that was the point. They didn't just, it wasn't a sort of tick box exercise. So real practical change in the use of stop and search, in the use of public order tactics. And the statistics, and because in Northern Ireland we've been collecting these statistics, analysing them, publishing them, we could see that it was working. So the use of stop and search against young people, we published it by age. When I say segregated, that's partly what I mean. We were able to say that the use of stop and search against young people was just decreasing. It was becoming more effective because there were a greater number of arrests following stop and search, a greater number of charges, and we were able to look at what convictions were following and whether they were relevant convictions. Now, I think also in fairness, I have to say, this continues to be a problem. So young people will still tell me that things get better for a period of time, and then all of a sudden they're being stopped and searched all over again, and they're being stopped all the time. They're not being given their stop and search records, bad attitude by police. They have explained to them why they're being stopped and searched, and they're told none of your business. That's the sort of thing we've been hearing about. So it needs to be, that's why it needs to be relentless, it needs to be constant, and you need to pursue and monitor what they do with these regulations. In relation to people from minority ethnic communities as well, it was a very similar approach. So it was again this root and branch reform of policy, training, practice, operational use of powers. And by looking at statistics, which were also disaggregated according to minority ethnic background and whether a person was from a traveller background, what we identified was that travellers were significantly more likely to be stopped and searched by the police, but no more likely to be found to have done anything wrong. And when that's presented in statistical, incontrovertible form to police, they have to really start asking themselves, what are we doing here? Why is our reasonable suspicion made out in relation to travel and not somebody else? And yet when we search them, they haven't done anything wrong. And what was also quite revealing was what they searched them, stopped and searched them for. So it's handling stolen goods, primarily, and drugs. So we could tell there was a problem. We got an inkling what the problem was, and it enables you to go to the police and say, you need to really think about what you're doing here, and you need to talk to your officers, you need to engage with the travelling community and really listen to what they're saying. Get them in and to advise you, get them in to help you train, and treat them with respect while they're there, please. Don't just pick them up and drop them. I think that where I should round this up is that if you're going to do it and you really want to do it properly, it needs to be across the board. You cannot leave things like security, state security, policing out of account. It is a nonsense to say that you have a human rights compliant police service, but a whole part of that policing service is conducted secretly. They are as human rights obligated as anybody else, but at the minute there's absolutely nobody who can verify whether or not they're complying with the convention or not. And that's a real problem, it seems to me. Northern Ireland, I think, has really grappled with this and has found a solution. It's not perfect because the oversight is limited to a very small number. And I was one of those people, so I had to go through what was a horrible security clearance process, very intrusive. But what it did was enable me to look at that material, which they said was too sensitive to share with any more widely. And I was able to then human rights proof various protocols, for example, between police and the security service and various guidance documents. And I was able to say, hand on heart to the policing board, actually this is complying with the European Convention. They have taken account of all the necessary standards. Whether or not that happens in practice all the time, I can't guarantee. But I was allowed access to live operations and to command rooms and to decision making as it was happening. So if you want to know if a police service is human rights compliant, I'm afraid you have to get as up close and personal as that. You have to trust somebody or some people to do it. And you have to find an outlet by which they can report their findings. And if they report findings which are not received well by, for example, An Garda Siochana or anybody else, you need to find a way to support them and protect them in the delivery of that. It takes time, resources, dedication, I think bloody-mindedness, probably more than anything else. But what you get is a police service ultimately which is professional. Morale is boosted. I saw a huge boost in morale within PS9 until, of course, their budget was cut and then sunk again. But real boost in morale when they realise that just how professional they are and just how much the community regards them and looks to them for their protection and no longer thinks of them as the ones who are going to violate their rights. You end up with a service that's united and ultimately cost effective, because this stuff, I think that's probably the final thing I would leave you with, this works. It reduces tensions on the street, It brings people who previously would never have engaged with police or policing on board, and it delivers a much better targeted service. Coming back just very briefly to the issue of children and young people, when police started realising that children and young people were not a problem for the most part, their resources became much more efficiently targeted because they weren't responding to every single call. If somebody said, there's about 20 kids outside my house, come and move them on, the police would say, well, they're probably not doing anything wrong. There's nothing to fear. We know the kids. So it's a vicious circle. And as soon as they break that cycle, they can target their resources more effectively, and they can say, actually, that's not something we feel we need to come out to, and we're going to go and deal with something else. So it does work, and if you can you've got a terrific commission set up and a policing authority, and if you can put your support behind them and the government buy into it, I think you can come up with a model much better than Northern Ireland. You've seen what works and what doesn't. So you have my best wishes, and I do think good luck. You're going to need it.
Thanks, Alison. I think there's two messages from what Alison has said, and they directly connect to the presentations beforehand. The first one is it's a hugely hopeful and positive message that what we're talking about can be done. It will make a real difference in communities. It will address the problems that Gareth, Davy and Fiona have identified. On the other hand, the other message that I take from it is that if you're serious about it, it's going to take time, it's going to take money, it's going to take commitment, it's going to take leadership. That it's not easy. So it's somewhere between this. There's the danger of the tick boxing exercise where everybody pays lip service to human rights-based policing, but actually isn't really committed in the longer term. And we have a lot of experience of that kind of stuff in Ireland and in Garda reform in particular. But anyway, I'm not here to talk. We've got a short period of time for questions and answers from people in the audience. I'm not going to name individuals, but we've representatives here from some of the oversight bodies, from the Commission for Future Policing, from community organisations working with these issues, and the coalface people practising. So there's a lot of knowledge in the room. I'd ask people maybe to identify themselves if they have any questions, or even just comments for the panellists from what you've heard.
Thomas McCann from the...
Thomas, can you just ask you to stand up just so you can hear?
Thomas McCann's I've been involved in travel advice for about 35 years, and I'm a traveller myself. And just to say, just in terms of Alison, there's been a lot of change in the North over the last number of years, so there has. And the relationship between travellers in all of Ireland, I would say, and in the North as well, even though there's been a lot of change, is similar in some ways. The relationship that existed between the nationalist community and the RUC, in terms of, if you look at raids on sites or group houses, for instance, and I know there's a lot of work going on with Dave, and I've worked very closely with Dave and with the community policing. If you look at raids on sites and group housing, the whole site is raided. The whole group housing is raided. It's not an individual address. We have armed Gardaí coming in and putting people on the ground and holding guns to their head and coming away with people who might have owed a fine at the end of it. I mean, that's the kind of policing that's taking place. It's over-the-top policing of the community. And that has happened in a recent one out in the north side of Dublin, where a middle-aged grandmother was put on the ground and a gun was put to her head while her home was being torn apart. That is the kind of policing. At funerals, you see it on the media, you see it where armed Gardaí are on the street for the funeral. It's no wonder the pubs in Ireland closed down. When you see armed Gardaí in the street for a funeral, like stopping traffic, I mean, it's over the top. And in a recent survey carried out by Behaviour and Attitudes, just the kind of, in terms of reflective of what is happening, 70% of the community, there was the research that was carried out by Behaviour and Attitudes on behalf of the Community Foundation Ireland, found that 70% of the travellers interviewed across Ireland, and it was a very wide survey, said they had been discriminated against by the Gardaí when they went into any engagement with the Gardaí. 70%. That's only last year, 2017. So there has never been a trust. between the Gardaí and travellers in this state, from the foundation of the state, I would say. Because I think, when the state was founded, the Guards just picked up from where the English constabulary left off, I think there's the trust, and that's the work that's been going on with Dave, and particularly with the community guards, is building that. Because in enforcing a rights-based approach, when you're educationally disadvantaged, excluded, and don't have the resources, it's very difficult to actually get your rights. And there was a legal unit that we established, that I helped establish. Davey was part of it as well, for travellers. That was closed down because there was no resources there. Now, it's very difficult to kind of to change that. And the last point I would make is that the attitude of the Gardaí, now I'm not saying all Gardaí, there are some, and we work, as I said, we work very closely with them, and we're trying to create change, and there is some positive stuff going on, is that the attitudes of the Gardaí reflect the attitudes of wider society, the negative attitudes towards travellers, and that's in all the research that's carried out, which is based on negative and racist stereotypes. And the same is happening to Roma people now as well. So that's the situation we're in, So just to say that.
Can I just offer some, what I would have said if I'd stuck to my script at all, about the way we tried to address this in Northern Ireland. You're absolutely right about trust and all those things. But it was a question of which came first. How do you build trust if you're still carrying on this bad practice? And the beauty about a human rights-based approach is you say to police officers what rights are engaged here. So they're going to visit a group housing scheme. What rights are engaged? Of course, is the right to respect for privacy. That means you have to establish the basis upon which you're going in the first place. You're invading somebody's privacy. You keep it to an absolute minimum. You don't treat the site, and even worse when it came to the service sites, so the holding sites.
But these are individual houses.
No, absolutely. But they were seeing it as just a collection of people. Each one of whom was basically fair game, a target. They could stop and search. They could issue.
And I agree. There's a real need for a rights-based approach, but there's a need to also kind of make sure that the structures are in place that people can exercise them rights, because
you're absolutely right. Because if we don't find out that they're not adopting this human rights-based approach routinely and improving upon its exercise, then it's no use. So we had to find ways of them feeding into me, and I would be able to put it in the annual reports, but also the advisory groups. So we set up a specific advisory group with travellers on it.
At the minute there is rights there that I see is being breached every day of the week. But there's very little avenues available to people, and people on the ground are struggling to get people to kind of use them avenues and trying to get the resources.
You need to encourage the GSOC and the other oversight bodies as well to engage.
But also, there's also another side to that when people did make complaints at local level, they were victimised for it. So there's a big fear, and that came across.
That picks up on what Gareth was talking about, I think, as well. The reality of people saying that they have to go back and live in the communities.
We do look at this in the report we're working on.
It's
an area we cover quite extensively.
The other point that really struck me from Alison's, you can measure success because you have information. We don't have data at all. With regard to even crime, much less the behaviour of our police. So there's a fundamental problem there about where you're starting from.
Yeah, I think we need to move to a culture of rights.
I'm just trying to bring a couple of more people in. Declan here.
Declan Cool. I previously worked on projects between areas in Ballymun, Inglis and West Belfast and East Belfast in regards to community reconciliation, peace building through European project Peace Treaty, Future Generations project. But my question is in regards to, two questions in regards to one half the panel and then to Alan specifically, but to the panel. One of the aspects that I noticed within the reports that was given to the Gardaí to the police and party more recently in regards to their compliance reports was that the reform package that has been done by the Guards, this present reform package that's been done by the Guards, there's a significant element of civilianisation of the Guards. So the Guards want to recruit 500 new civilian civil servants to do some of the police work. which includes a competition that has just finished in regards to policing crime and analysis, as an EO position I think it is. And my question would be, for Fiona and also for the lawyers around, would be relevant for specific training, since the data is not there, for specific training on how to use statistical analysis for crime and policing to help communities, to help build relationships, not to just use statistics as a punitive measure to attack communities with. So that would be my first question. And then my second question, specifically to yourself, Alice, and it's kind of off kilter a bit, because it's going to talk about Brexit. Brexit has the Parliament in the UK are deciding whether to leave the European Union. As part of that, they want to reform their human rights approach, which I believe is actually a delineation of their human rights responsibilities, and move backwards in human rights responsibilities. And how does that affect what you have just talked about in regards to, is this only a phenomenon of human rights approach to policing in Northern Ireland, or will the leaving of the UK from the European Union and the Covenant on Human Rights in Europe lead to a digression in a human rights approach in Northern Ireland? So that's just my question. Thank you.
Maybe do the other panelists first. Do you
Yeah, I think the point about statistics is that I'm struck by when Alice was speaking as well. I mean, obviously the Gardaí are funded by the state, we're funded by ourselves, we're taxpayers or whatever it might be. So their resources necessarily are not infinite. They have control of what the police have. And obviously knowing how they use the resources. I mean, it's a primary focus, or the primary objective of the Garda, or the Garda as an institution, is to detect crime and prevent, protect citizens. Knowing who they're investigating, knowing that, I think the point was made, the point kind of change in attitude in the North is because we began to look at the statistics. Okay, we're stopping X number of young people, but we're actually doing very little. We're just harassing them. We're not actually detecting any crime, so we're not meeting our true objective. And I think if statistics like that could be applied, and you don't know who monitors it, where do you apply, and you apply it, you can take an example of the travel community and say, okay, if we stopped, if we look at the number of times we stop Gardaí, or we use resources like Thomas has said earlier on, the misuse of resources, putting 20 guys armed to their teeth into 3 vans and sending them out to a hauling site, it costs a few quid. And so if you actually did a kind of a cost analysis of this type of policing, you may well find that's not worth it. You're not detecting any crime, you're not looking at what is the return on that investment. So stop doing it and then take a different approach. And so it's very simple. I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, but maybe if you get involved, they might produce better statistics. Thomas used perfect examples. I didn't want to get too negative when I was speaking, I'm going to go through hundreds of them. But recently I was involved with a client who was a discrimination case in a pub in town, in a local bar in the centre of town. He himself and a friend approached the bar, were refused, and he kicked up a stink. He didn't get violent, but he challenged the refusal. So effectively we had a discrimination issue happening in the pub under the Equality Act. Someone behind the bar, a manager, rang the Gardaí and said, look, there's a group of travellers in the pub here, they're causing a stink, and I think it's turning into a riot. Within 5 minutes, there were 4 vans outside with armed police, riot squad. They came in and they looked at what happened. Okay, what's going on here? Two travellers arguing with a barman, or arguing with a barman saying you discriminate against me. And they said, there's no issue here. Go back into the bar and drop off. I think in those circumstances, the waste of resources, the person who called the Gardaí, clearly was one member of the staff, should have been prosecuted for wasting police resources. So, but it's an issue like that gets ignored, and yet there was still an issue going on. So, I think I agree with you. Gathering statistics and knowing what the return you're getting for the type of policing you're delivering will be very important. And, as I said, when the bean counters get involved, perhaps policies change and practices change. And again, sorry not for keeping, but just to respond to Thomas, I think it does happen where collectivization of travellers in terms of searches, search warrants, being used, we all know, and from a lawyer's perspective, we know that search warrant is very limited. It has to have a very limited effect. It can only be used in certain circumstances. It has to be very specific. They get abused left, right, and centre when they come to travellers' accommodation, travel housing. And unfortunately, it's not challenged. Sometimes the travellers have done other rights in respect to the searches, and sometimes solicitors may not take on cases on their behalf to challenge things. And also be hitting them in their pockets, suing them on the basis of abuse of the constitutional rights is very important, and having access to justice, having access to lawyers to do that on your behalf is very important as well. When you start doing it like that, practices change. But I do think statistics are important, and certainly, and listen to what Alison said, like, important for the reason that you can actually analyse the return you're getting instead of policing and delivering.
Could I just come back to the question, which I think is a good one, about the civilitisation of Gardaí and using data and information in a positive way as opposed to a punitive way, I think is the way that you rightfully put it. A number of years ago in the Children's Court, and our friends from the Garda Diversion Project will know that when a child has a negative interaction with Gardaí, there's a whole process that must be gone through before we arrive at a decision to prosecute. And then beyond that, in terms of the DPP and the decision to prosecute, they look at the interests of victims, they look at the interests of society as a whole, and they look at the individual circumstances of the alleged offender. There's a big process involved there. And I often, I guess, worried that in terms of that information and that discretion that Alison talked about, that we were making really, really important decisions about the future lives of children and young people without having the appropriate information available. And so we started off with a district court judge who's now very sadly deceased, the probation services, buy-in from the Department of Justice, Children and Youth Affairs, and the idea was that we would meet as a working group to discuss how we would be better sharing information between various agencies about young people who had come into conflict with the law. And we had a number of meetings about it, but can I say, it very quickly ran into the ground. And the reason it ran into the ground was this collective fear that the culture within An Garda Siochana would prevent sensitive information being dealt with in a sensitive manner. And so there were too many landmines identified to trust a process that could actually lead to a very positive outcome for young people. So very unfortunately, an initiative which had very good objectives couldn't be realised because the concern was that in fact that information about a young person, their family background, their interaction with other services, their educational background and issues and so on, that information, we wouldn't have the systems in place within An Garda Siochana to ensure that information wouldn't be used and abused in a manner that would be a further breach of a young person's rights. So that was a project that actually fell to pieces very quickly as a result.
This is the other side of the data point.
Yes,
I mean,
and that was before data protection.
Yeah, it's the integrity of data. It's policing having respect for data in terms of personal information, which is a key problem, which comes up time and time again. Fiona and
yeah, just maybe briefly, a lot's been said, but I mean there are some examples of communities who work together with a human rights-based approach to challenge other issues, as people here can talk more about it in terms of, say, open house and issues around housing and rights and working from a rights perspective. One of the issues, and it's what Garrett really said earlier, is around fear young people have around, even when they know their rights, in terms of using statistics or knowing the law, just the actual power interaction on the street. I mean, when we, even just for one event, the event where we brought together the guards and the young people in the triangular encounter, we had endless meetings with the chief superintendent about who those guards would be. And originally we thought maybe they could be more senior guards who might have more influence, but it was actually the young people's fear that the guards might recognise themselves in the stories, even though the stories were anonymous, that the guards may identify themselves, and it wasn't going to go well for the young person the next time they were on their own on a street. So just the level of fear and the sense of I still have to go home and it's not worth the fight was really hard to get through. The idea of working together as a community and standing up to something obviously has more power and safety. So just to add that.
Yeah, in relation to the statistics, one thing I would say is that they're not kept so as to catch people out, to catch the police out, and today we've got you. They are used so everyone knows what we're actually talking about and what we're dealing with. And in fact, quite early on, there was one situation where it was alleged that police were using a power against a group of people disproportionately. The police said, we are sure, we've looked at this, we've thought about it, we've searched ourselves, we know we do not do this. And I said, well, that's fine. Well, how do you know? We just know. Well, how is anybody else supposed to know? And they said, right, we're going to start counting it. And they did. They counted it for 12 months. They produced the figures, and they proved that and the police love statistics for a short period of time, of course, until then we say, well, this works. Let's keep them on this, and some of the other analyses didn't prove quite as positive, but so it works. But it can be used very positively as well. The EU Brexit thing, it's just a catastrophe, but how it actually affects human rights, it's a wee bit more nuanced, I suppose. We're not leaving the Council of Europe with the Convention, so human rights will still be protected. However, having said that,
The Tory party wants to leave.
there is the narrative, and the narrative in Northern Ireland at the minute is poisonous when it comes to human rights. It's become a them and us situation, from lack of understanding and just plain mischievousness and politicking. So what's good for them is bad for them. You know what I'm talking about. So this could start there could be an increased momentum to leave the Council of Europe and Convention, or at least start to disapply it. Certainly they still talk about ripping up the Human Rights Act, etc. It will be a disaster for policing in Northern Ireland. And even if nobody agrees, nobody in the room agrees with me, or why should you? The current Chief Constable, I asked him, and he was asked actually at a public event, so I can share this with you. His answer was, I'm not allowed to be political, however. It seems to me this has been very positive. And he was essentially saying, if you care about policing and you care about us being effective and efficient, delivering a good service, protect the Human Rights Act and make me do this, and let me say to my police officers, I have to do this legally and you're going to have to do it legally too. But he's very clear it makes his job much more difficult, but he was also very clear that even if the Human Rights Act is ripped up, Policing Board loses all its functions, they will still follow this model. They will still pursue this human rights-based approach because it works, it's been really effective. It'll just be a lot more difficult to start becoming much more discretionary and aspirational, all those things I said shouldn't happen. There won't be a legal framework to do it. But he wants to continue with this because it works and he hasn't got there yet. So I think that tells you anything you need to know about it. But they are going to play with it and we are potentially going to lose it. And it terrifies me we're not going to leave.
I know that we have other people that want to come in. Unfortunately, we're well over time at this stage. I just want to say that this event in many ways is a taster for a bigger event which will take place on the 14th of September, when Alison's full report on human rights-based policing in Ireland will be launched at the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and we'll have details of that very shortly. There's a moment that we have here, and as I said, as members of the Commission on Future Policing here, where we have an opportunity to finally get things right with Garda reform. There's a lot of very important ideas out there, and this can be done if there's a genuine seriousness, and I think there is a strong community support and political support at this time, which we have to grasp. I just finally want to thank on all of your behalf our three panellists, David Joyce, Gareth Noble, Fiona Whelan, our researcher at the moment who's bringing forward this work for us, Alison Kilpatrick, to thank you all for coming, and also just finally to thank our funders and our supporters. This is an important day for us because it's our AGM as well. Our work on police reform is supported by the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and the Community Foundation for Ireland. We also are very grateful for the support of individuals who are members and supporters who are supporting our work more generally. We have a Friends of ICCL group, some of whom are here with us this evening, who support independent human rights advocacy in Ireland. And we include among those a number of individuals, but also a number of companies, particularly law firms. KOD Lyons, of whom Garda is a partner, also Sheehan and Partners, Michael Staines and Company, and Michael Finucane Solicitors, and a number of senior counsel and junior counsel at the bar. They are what allow us to do the work that we're doing, and it's important that we recognise this. We don't take money from the government because we're an independent human rights organisation. So it's important for us to shake a bucket at the end of an evening like this, and if any of you would like to support our work through our website, there are plenty of ways for you to do so, iccl.ie. Thank you for coming along, and we hope to see you again in September at our next event.
Nice.